Hey guys, I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for coming to this conference virtually. Hopefully this is the last one we have to do for a while. I'm going to be talking today about building well, okay? Building and using historic building methods and historic ways of construction that I actually think have proven the test of time and have last longer than new construction details. And so there's so much that we can learn from the past, so much that we can learn by looking at historic buildings as a pathway for building better today. Now, that's essentially what my business is. I went to North Bennett Street in Boston almost 30 years ago and studied historic preservation. We were studying the ways buildings have been built 200 years ago. And by doing that, we began to understand and learn methods of construction and better ways of building. I think what's happened today, and if you look real quickly, kind of the history of building and kind of how we got here, there's definitely a difference from the way we used to build to the way we build today. So 200 years ago, we were building using natural wood, natural stone, natural products. Fast forward 200 years and we use a lot of plastic concrete products. We have introduced into our building systems new ways of building and new things. Now, a lot of those products have been introduced in order to overcome what I think is kind of a circular problem, bad construction. Windows rot or wood rots, and we go, well, we have to get product that doesn't rot. So plastic and concrete and other products are introduced because we're seeing wood rot. Now, the quality of wood, and we'll talk about the quality of wood and what good wood is, but our wood is not as good as it used to be. So that is certainly a proponent of it. Is it 2% or is it 80%, right? I think it's closer to the 2%. And I think we've forgotten simple building methods that can help us build better. Simple ways of constructing a wall, okay? Constructing a windowsill so that it pitches, reintroducing a drip edge. Little small things that you find in historic trade catalogs, that you find 100 years ago in the prints and the other things in my library of Georgian, French, English details that used to work, okay? That were introduced for a reason, and we've kind of forgotten those things. Remember that coming out of World War II, we enter a time of period where there was an incredible housing shortage, and William Levitt begins the production building era. Now, I'm not going to blame all bad building on production building, but I do think that it taught us how to build cheap and fast, and it taught us how to construct houses very quickly, right? In doing that, and that two generations of builders that learned to build that way, now the majority of houses that we are building today, in my opinion, are quickly built, cheaply built, and not meant to last. And so by introducing some of these building methods, do they cost a little bit more? Yes. Sometimes they don't cost any more. Sometimes they cost a little bit more. Sometimes they might cost a lot more. But when you consider that it's going to last 50 or 100 or 200 years versus 15 or 20, is that worth it? And I'll leave that to you to decide. But traditional building methods can be practiced today, and I'm going to walk you through a number of areas that we concentrate on, that maybe the top 3, top 5 building methods and building secrets, right, that can help us build better today, help us to have products that are longer lasting, help us to have windows that last 100 years, right? Imagine that. It begins with good wood, it begins with building traditions, building secrets, and we're going to go into all that today. A quick story that I think illustrates this idea, and it's burned into my head. It was the very first meeting of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art in Texas, okay? It was at this wonderful house designed by Quinlan Terry of England, probably the strongest proponent today of building traditionally, okay? And his houses are beautifully detailed, beautifully done, and he built one in Dallas. Quinlan is so old school that he won't design kitchens or bathrooms because they're too new, right? Well, one of the things that came up when he was talking, and the architect of record is a friend of mine, Larry Borders in Dallas, and Larry stands up and says, he's introducing Quinlan to the crowd, and he said, this building's meant to last 250 years without any major maintenance the way it was built. And he describes one of the stories of the masons who they were laying the block up, and Quinlan came, and the mortar lines between the block were 3/8 of an inch instead of 1/8 of an inch. And so, building stops, he's like, you can't do it that way. If we're gonna build a building that's gonna last a long time, we can't have huge mortar lines because that's the weak point, right? That's the sacrificial material. It's gonna fall out and you're gonna have to repair this sooner. So immediately, even before we heard Quinlan talk, we hear this idea that, oh, wait a minute, there's a tighter precision, there's a tighter way of building that we should practice to help us build better. And Quinlan stands up and says, actually, that 250 years is wrong. This building is meant to last 450 years without any major maintenance, okay? Right? Yeah, how do you build a building that lasts for 450 years without major maintenance? Well, it means you're not putting things in like insulated glass, right? Because that's a 10, 15, 20-year product. All of a sudden, as you start, and as I was sitting in the crowd listening, I started building the houses and thinking about how we were building and going, oh no, we can't do that. Oh no, we can't do that. I'm putting in temporary products. Now, I may be thinking that my temporary products will last 100 years, but if 450 years is the bar, right, then it requires us to build differently, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. All right, so the first really management trick and things that we can learn from the past that we can apply today is water management. Now, water management comes in a number of ways. It's one, pushing water away from the house, right? So that, and pushing water away from our materials so that they don't become saturated and rot. There are, many, many examples of this water management. The first one that comes to mind is if you think about the classical era and the classical period, and what we learn from those building traditions is that, in this entablature, this is the Ionic order, right? We have our entablature, which hangs over the column, right? Right here, okay, there's a little drip edge, okay? And that even the ancients, right, looking at how they were building and how they were doing, wanted any water that came and wasn't collected in a gutter, if they didn't put a drip edge here, this water is all of a sudden running down the face of your entablature. And I'm sure you've seen those streaks of water and streaks of black that come across our buildings and things like that. That's a mismanagement of water. Now, some of that can't be helped if you've got a driving rain and things like that. But the introduction of a drip edge. Now, you might think that is, well, come on, everybody knows how to do that. But that's one of those things, that's one of those habits that we've kind of forgotten how to build. And I can't tell you the number of times that a drip edge has saved a problem for us, particularly around doors and windows. Now, historically, a drip edge always occurred on doors and windows, okay? I remember working on a lady's house and she had these French doors that were 12 foot tall, 10 or 12 foot tall. They were right out on the face of the building. So they were under the brick wall, but they were basically completely exposed. And water was coming under her doors and flooding in heavy rains her living room. We took the doors and we added a big drip edge onto it, right? We put a drip edge onto the front edge of their door. Basically what we were doing was we were cheating and kicking water away. So the door came down, right? Little bit of a threshold there. This did pitch away, but her living room was basically right here. And all we did was we cut in a drip edge that did this, okay? We had our little stop there, and that's what we put on the door. And literally a gallon of water would come into the thing. Just imagine pouring a gallon of water out. Just this water would flood across their floor whenever it rained. And introducing a drip edge like that onto our doors changed the water management issue, right? We no longer had water flooding into their house, a very simple detail that we learned from, and now all our exterior doors have a drip edge on them. We just don't care. It's just the right way to build. And the more I looked around as I studied historic buildings, I was in New Orleans and I was looking at all the historic doors, and you could see the historic doors because they had a drip edge on them. And so if you have French in-swing doors, if you have French in-swing windows, you will have a drip edge on those things to manage water and get it away from the building. Now that may seem like, well, come on, Brent, everybody knows that. I was at a small town in West Texas 2 weeks ago doing a class on window workshops, and they needed to rebuild their downtown. They were doing storefronts, and probably 4 of the new storefronts that were built had a flat windowsill. So in other words, if their storefront basically, right, here's their storefront, and they had a brick ledge, say at the bottom, they had a transom window up here. this edge and this edge were flat, meaning the sash were built and they were captured in a jam, a flat jam like this, okay? So instead of incorporating a sill, okay, which pitches water away from the building and it has a drip edge in it, right? So that any water that comes here drips down away from your building, right? They had a flat sill. Now, this goes back to my whole thing that we've forgotten how to build. We've forgotten the lost art of building. The difference between good and great is about 1/8 of an inch, and that's how big a drip edge is, right? That's how big these little things that we do and manage that can help our buildings last longer. So there's water management, just keeping water away from the building, okay? There's also water management in wall systems that we're building. Now, realize that 200 years ago, right, if you were going to build a brick house, okay, your house was basically a solid masonry wall, right, that windows were set in and rafters came across the top and everything else. So your masonry wall might be 12 or 14, 16, 18 inches thick, depending on the kind of building that it was. What that did was that there was even though there's wicking and movement of water, those systems, that system of building lasted a very long time. Now, somewhere around at the turn of the century, 1900, 1920, 1930, we began to have brick veneers, okay? And so basically, you know, if the historic, you know, period house was, you know, these brick walls, right, that were, you know, built up and this was your foundation. What happens now in the 1920s is that you have your beam, you know, your concrete beam wall. If there's a brick veneer, it would sit on a brick ledge, and then your stud framing would be right here, okay? So now we've gone from a 16-inch wall, 18-inch wall, right? This is a 1920s warehouse, and it has 18-inch walls on the outside of the building made up of 3 widths, 3 layers of brick, right? Now, the wall systems that we use today, or they're most common, have a concrete, you know, right, this is a concrete beam wall. There's a brick ledge, if there is a brick, you know, that goes on it here, and then you've got your stud wall here. So the brick has become something that's no longer structural, okay? It is now just a veneer laid on top of your wall. There's a trick that's happened, right, to building, and there's a piece of building that makes it harder today, especially for new homes, and it's all about build science, okay? Now, build science means that you're trying to build a house that is very tight, okay? You're trying to build a house that doesn't breathe a lot, right? You actually are introducing fresh air into your house because our houses are so tight. What that means, though, is that the whole black mold problem, the whole mold problem, that's only a product of the last 20 or 30 years as we begin to insulate our houses differently. So what ends up happening now is that these houses, okay, that used to, let's just say this same wall assembly with our brick here and our stud wall here, now this wall is filled up with foam, okay? And the whole envelope of the house is tightened up. Well, what's happened is where this house, okay, in the 1920s probably didn't have much insulation in the wall. If water, okay, if we had a heat spell and it rained, what happens on that brick wall is the moisture sits out here, the sun hits your wall, it drives your moisture into the wall. The reason that there are weep holes at the bottom of a brick wall is because moisture happens just like condensation happens on a piece of glass, moisture happens on the inside of your brick wall and it comes out right at the bottom, okay? So water is trapped, is caught between those two spaces, right? Well, when we end up foaming and tightening up our houses so much, the houses don't breathe as well. And so this water comes in here and ends up staying in here and ends up rotting the bottom sills. It ends up, because the houses don't breathe like they used to, we've created a problem, okay? Now, we just built a house recently and we did stucco. And if you look at the way stucco walls are built today, okay, now historically stucco was a product that would be put onto an old wall after the brick had begun to fall apart, right? Today, what you have is you have your stud wall, and instead of having your brick veneer out here, okay, it's just all stucco, right? And so they put their sheeting on the outside of the stud wall, and then they attach their wire lath directly to that, and they stucco right on top of that. Now, what happens is now there is very little. Sometimes there'll be a paper in here that is supposed to shed water and things like that. But remember that when that Tyvek or the paper is applied to the wall, it's nailed onto that wall, okay? That means there's all these perforations and all these punctures in the wall and in the skin of the house. So now when this wall gets wet and moisture comes, you've actually got moisture coming into your stud cavity and even, you know, rotting your sheetrock, okay? Now, what we've done to overcome this is that we have reintroduced a exterior wall, okay? So when we build our stucco walls, we're actually putting our stucco on block, okay, on a masonry material. Not only does that help us because think about a masonry material and a wood material, they're gonna move very differently. By doing this, you know, you just create cracks in your walls and things like this in this method. In this method, we're now putting stucco on the outside of block, and we've reintroduced a breathing strip between the air. There's an air gap between your stud wall and your stucco wall. And this is a much more long-lasting way of building. I remember I did a garage this way where we did the stud wall and we put the plaster stucco right over top of the stud wall, and it lasted probably 10 years before it started cracking and about 15 years before we had to replace it. It just isn't a long-lasting way of building. We do this stucco, the block on the stucco, and we've got a 100-year way of building that there isn't movement between the wood cavity, the wood wall, and the block. There's an air gap that has been reintroduced, and we have a way of weeping water away from the house and building a much better, longer lasting wall. Water management comes in kind of two forms, right? Water management comes in the form of drip edges and things that you're introducing into a building to make it last longer. I can think of 3 or 4 or 5 different types of drip edges that we need to do to manage doors and windows. If you have an exterior wall and you have an outswing door, okay, this is a great place to introduce a drip edge over that door so that it can still swing out, but that water doesn't come down the face of your building and land on top of that door, okay, and rot that door out. There are ways of building at the top of if you're sticking a window into a wall, right, and it's a siding wall, that there should be some flashing that comes over top of each of these moldings so that the moldings shed water away from your window. Also, any exterior molding that we do, we have a slope on it, okay? We do not want any flat spots where water can sit and rot things out. And we're using good wood, right? But this is picture sills, and that can be, window sills, drip caps at the top of windows, molding trim, molding details should all be sloped. Any place that you start thinking about your building and where water is going to hit and where water is going to get in, you need to introduce drip caps so that you can manage that water. And then as building systems become more complicated, become more intricate, there's a way of building these walls so that any moisture management coming into your walls can make your wall last longer. So one of the other things, we talk about in water management quite a bit is on doors and windows. And I'm going to show you our drip edge and what that looks like and how we make it work inside a door. Essentially, we think by building with these methods and with these details, we can build a longer lasting door. Now, what are they? Well, first, we build our doors with stave cores. Now, stave core means that the inner core is made up of these staves. And so they're basically wood that's oriented opposite from the face grain of the wood. And you'll see that we have 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch veneers on top of either side. Now, we learned about stave cores when we were working on a historic depot in Temple, Texas, where all their exterior doors are made with stave core. And even though they were fairly exposed to the weather, they had never rotted, okay? And so we were pretty stoked to learn about this historic building method and realized that by doing stave core doors with sapele, right, kind of our wood of choice as far as how we do exterior wood, we are building a very long-lasting door. Thick veneers on the outside, stave core on the inside means the door is stable, long-lasting, and looks beautiful. The other thing is this drip edge, which we've talked quite a bit about. And this drip edge actually is kind of slotted in there with a dovetail joint to keep it in there. Now notice my little cap here is sloped, and then we've of course got the drip edge down here, and at the bottom of the door, this keeps your door water from running inside here. It hits the outside and slips away. And so again, drip edges. I've talked about that probably too much now, stave core. And then we even will sometimes introduce a weep hole, okay? And we've seen this in French windows, we've seen this in French doors, where the slot where your panel sits down inside that door can be a big water trap, right? That just looks like a big, channel for water to hang out in. And we noticed that the French would oftentimes drill these little holes or build these little weep holes into their doors as a release mechanism so that any water built up in there will release and get out of there. So when we're building exterior products, we're using good wood, right? We're using stave core for stability. We're introducing the drip edge wherever we can, and we're trying to water manage as best we can in as many areas as we can. And part of this is just all a process of trying to figure out, how to make something last longer. And of course, the last thing is a mortise and tenon joint, right? That this is your tenon, right? That we actually peg, okay? That's what those holes are for. And so our mortise of our style sits right in here, and we believe this is the best and most longest lasting joinery. It's the strongest joinery we can find for joining windows and doors and things like that. So this is how we build a great long lasting door, but we're just copying the past. Last little trick we had recently is with wood siding on a new house. And what we did is we had our stud wall. Okay, we had our zip board on top of that, and we wanted to put a piece of wood siding over top of it. Now, I like wood, okay? I'm an old school guy. I don't like concrete. I don't like plastic. I don't like those fake products, okay? Because I think we can build well enough that we don't have to go substitute those things in order to build that way. There are more building details that I can do around a window or a door or a water table or all the different kind of things that are part of a wood siding house that I can't find those products in a concrete and plastic world. So I think I can build better details this way. But what happens is that if this was the side of our house, right, and we've got Tyvek on there, if I took my siding and just nailed it right to this Tyvek, one, that piece of wood is going to sit tight against the piece of Tyvek. So what we had to do, we had to introduce an air gap. And so all along our studs, we had these little strips that are about 1/4 of an inch thick and about 2 inches wide, right? And this is what we then put our siding over top of, okay? Because now we had an air gap and the air could move through here, right? Dry out the back side of the thing. It meant the paint didn't flake off, the paint didn't fall apart, because anytime paint's bubbling or cracking or coming apart, you've got moisture in your wood and it's breathing out and it's pushing the paint off the surface of the wood. So by putting our little strip on top of there and then putting our siding right on top of that, we now had an air gap in there. And so all of your wall assemblies, all of these details need to be thought about in terms of water management, because that is the key. If you can manage water well, masonry buildings do a great job of that. Think about historic buildings and how they were built. The solid stone, the solid brick, that size and heft of those walls helped manage the moisture. As we introduce wood and wood products into our deal, especially with new wood, you need to manage the water in every detail in every place so that your buildings last longer. So another way that I think historic buildings and traditional building methods can teach us, right, is, and a good example is windows, right? We've been restoring windows for 30 plus years, and we've been taking these windows and we take them back to the shop, we reglaze them, we fix them and paint them again and put them back in, and we have every expectation that they're going to last 100 years. Why is it that our windows are rotting out 10 and 15 years later? Why is it that the replacement window industry is spending more time replacing their own windows than replacing old wood windows? So if you look at these products, right, and we looked at it from the perspective of, gosh, they're 100 years old and they've lasted all this time and they're actually still in pretty good shape, instead of, oh my gosh, they're old, they're leaky, they're rotten, whatever the situation is. And look, there are old rotten windows, okay? But the vast majority of windows that are replaced today that are historic, in my opinion, do not need to be replaced. The first thing we did was we looked at the past. Now, this is a book of construction details, right? It's called Building Details. Frank Snyder did it. And look at all these great architects on here. McKean, Mead, and White, right? probably the most famous architects from the early 1900s, a number of jobs from their jobs. All these top architects, okay, they grabbed building details of their buildings, right? And some of the building details they grabbed were of windows. What we've done is we're looking at the best of the past. You might have an old house and go, oh, the window's rattly, it's not really insulated, right? You might have a, not a very good historic wood window. Now, the wood in it is so good it's going to last forever, but it still can be updated. And don't compare something that's 100 years old with something that's new and go, oh, that's terrible. No, the fact that it's still there 100 years later means that it can be restored and it can last for a long time. But we want to provide a window for those people whose windows have been torn out or who want something that's going to last a long time. So we looked at these details. Now this is from the Roosevelt residence. I don't think it's the Roosevelt, but you begin to look at some details that they're doing in their double hung windows, and we learn a lot from this. For one, they've got this divider between the window weights. Now what's that about? Well, sometimes you may know if you have old windows, when you lift the weights up, they might get stuck on each other or they might rattle together when you're doing it. We've put this divider, we saw it in historic things, and we put this divider in here so that the weights don't rattle, okay, so they don't get locked up. Notice too, this whole thing's called a weight pocket, okay? And sometimes on cheap windows, you don't have a backer board on the weight pocket. Ours have a backer board on the weight pocket. Why is that? Well, sometimes you put these in masonry walls and plaster will fall down or mortar will fall down into that area and actually stop the weights from going up and down. The best of the past, right? We've had these windows tested and we know that if those windows are weather stripped properly, right? If they're fitted properly, they test really well. Now, our experience working on these historic windows over time has made me realize the value in this historic building method, right? Looking at these building methods going, if I take the best of the past and incorporate that in a new window, we have a pretty darn good window that should last 100 years. In fact, we're going to call it the 100-year window. So let me show you some of those details. First, you'll notice that this is our weight pocket, right? The weights go up and down in here. You see these chained. There's a weight hung inside here. This is what's called the weight pocket, right? Ours has a back on the weight pocket. We saw that from those historic photos. Nothing's going to be able to get down in here. We've got a very clean weight pocket going forward. Our hardware is brass. We've got the chain that holds the pulleys. You can also do rope. It's double hung, right? So we've got an upper and a lower sash. It's weather stripped. We've discovered that when a window is weather stripped properly, it actually performs really well. So we've got a grooved weather stripping. We got a weather stripping at the check rail, which is this piece that runs across. And when this locks down, right, and I close this, boonk, right? It closes really sharp and tight, and it's going to test really well. This is a double hung, right? Which means the upper and lower sash both work, right? And so single hung, if it's only one sash works. Double hung, right? You don't have to get it that way. We've got these weather stripping details that tighten this window up. I spend a lot of time in my videos talking about good wood, how to make things last longer. And, I tell people that if you can get, one thing right, specify the right wood, and you will have something that lasts a lot longer. I shot this video recently. Let me show you this video. A lot of good stuff about wood. So wood quality, okay? Essentially, the production and harvesting of lumber, if you want to consider that, is really changed in the last 80 years, okay? Up until the 1940s, essentially all the wood that was being harvested in America was virgin forest, okay? As we moved across the country in the 1850s, 1860s, we essentially began to harvest, and as we developed those areas, we harvested that wood. So the eastern white pine in New York, the longleaf yellow pine, and then into the 1920s and 30s, the firs and redwoods out on the West Coast. Now, what that means is that today, most wood, especially production wood that would go into a production window, is plantation grown. That means it is harvested like you would harvest wheat or corn. Huge plantations in New Zealand and Chile where they grow trees in tree farms. Those trees grow really fast, okay? And they actually chose a western pine called radiata pine to go into those plantations because it grows so fast. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you've ever been to the redwood forest and know about how dark it is in there, how it's kind of gloomy, right? Well, essentially what happens is a tree growing up in this old growth forest would grow very slowly, okay? Because it might get sunlight for an hour a day, and it couldn't support a lot of branches, right? Sunlight allows the trees to support more branches. And so it would go up, and finally when it broke through the canopy, then it would start supporting a lot of branches. So what you have with an old growth tree is this very long trunk, and then these trees right at the top, as opposed to a plantation grown forest where all the trees are planted and they're very short and they're growing up almost like Christmas trees. And until they get 30 or 40 feet high and the sun can't hit the bark, they have all kinds of tree branches there. Now, what does that mean? A knot is where it's grown into the trunk of the tree, right? And so if you have a knot, that's because there was a branch going in there. Old growth lumber is very clear there. The other thing is, and if you compare these two pieces of wood, this is a piece of longleaf yellow pine. It's very old. Notice how tight those growth rings are, like 15 growth rings per inch versus this piece of yellow pine from a lumber yard where it might have 3 growth rings in an inch, okay? What does that mean? Well, growth rings are about stability, okay? So if you've ever seen a piece of 2x4 at a job site and it looks like a ski jump, right? That's because it has no stability. All of those growth rings add strength and stability, okay? Second part is because it grows up so slow, you have a lot more heartwood, okay? Heartwood is the good stuff, right? You have 2 types of wood. You have sapwood on the outside and you have heartwood in the middle. The more heartwood you have, the more rot and decay resistant it is. You can actually see on this piece of longleaf pine the color difference here and here, right? This is very light, this is very amber, okay? You can see it too here. So basically this is all heartwood and then this is sapwood. Now, Forest Product Labs, which is the government testing center for wood, and they have actually graded wood by how decay resistant it is. There's very resistant, moderate, and then non-resistant. Now, where do you think radiata pine lies out? Okay, it is a non-resistant wood, okay? So the fact that it's grown fast, there isn't any hardwood, and it's not very stable means it won't last very long. If you've ever had a new window or a new door that's decayed after 5, 10, 3, 4, 5 years, right? It's because the wood's no good. The wood is everything. And so if you have a house built before 1940, most likely your windows are made with old growth wood. So why would you throw something out that's going to last 100 years for something that's going to only last 20 years? Well, you wouldn't, right? And so it doesn't make sense for us to get rid of those old windows because we've got a product that's going to last so long. So the last piece of building technology and looking at the past to build beautiful today and build well today, long lasting, most of the stuff I've been talking about are the long-lasting details, right? That help your building last longer, the water management stuff. There are also just some beauty things, right? There's some things that when we copy the past, we actually end up having more beautiful details. I would point to the classical system, which I've learned about over the last 10 or 15 years, that this entablature, right, and the architrave and the frieze and the cornice and understanding the proportions of those details, understanding how the column fits and the size and the scale of it, and understanding the human scale, right, of the traditional building methods, and why we go to these old buildings, we go, I don't know why I like it, but I like it, right, is copying the past and using these beauty techniques to help us build better. Now, there are some other beauty things that happen. One of them is in brick, right? If you look at, and this is something that I didn't know immediately, there was something I learned. I did a house for John Milner here in Texas. He was the architect, and he came and he said, we did our brick arches wrong, right? Well, brick arch is basically, if you had a solid masonry wall, right? And you put a window in it, okay? On a solid masonry wall, right? If you cut a hole into it, that brick's gonna fall down into here, right? Well, historically, the way they manage that is they put either these stone or brick arches, okay, over top of it. And this key, right, that stuck over the brick here and stuck over it, kept everything from falling into your hole, okay? Now, brick arches were actually little bricks that do this over top, right? So a brick arch is an arch that goes over top. And what you find is when you study these arches, all of those little pieces are all made with just a little bit more angle, and each one is a little bit different so that it can span this opening. Now what that means is that when you order the brick from the brick manufacturer, you have to ask for gauged brick arches. And not every brick manufacturer is going to be able to do that, but they hand make those arches based on the side of your opening so you can have beautiful openings. Now, the difference is, and what happens today, and sometimes historically you would see like a keystone right here, right? Well, what happens today is that same opening, right? That brick, the window will go in here, and they will put a steel lintel in here, right? And then all that will happen is that there'll be a little keystone, even though the brick is still running this way. And so the problem is that the math and geometry that creates a beautiful keystone, right? That has to do with the relationship of these arches and where the points are and how these bricks all relate to this same radius point, right? Is lost here. And all of a sudden you have kind of a sticker, right? A kind of a traditional, oh, I need a keystone, I need a traditional house, so you put a sticker there. And that subtle detail, right? That 1/8 of an inch detail that makes it more beautiful in the past is something that if we practice those things, we can have more beautiful buildings, more beautifully scaled parts and pieces so that it looks right. So another area that ends up being messed up today, and it's a beauty point, is on roof eaves and roof returns. And what I'm talking about is that area of the roof on a traditional gable house where you have the roof ends that come around, right? And they stop, okay? So your gable goes up and your roof ends return. Now, typically what happens is that if we remember the kind of the entablature detail, we're basically creating a mini entablature at the top. So what happens is this roof comes down, your crown goes up, there's a split fillet here, this comes over, right? And so you end up having your corona, your bed mold, right? Maybe a little architrave, it goes around your building and it looks very pretty, right? And then your building is coming down here. What's happened today is that this used to be a detail that was fairly well understood, okay? But today what happens is if this ever leaked, okay, what you see today is builders that kind of build up a roof detail here, okay, and they've got this roof element now built over top of this to manage the water here. Because if I look at this in section, right, if our walls here, that little thing that comes up, our bed mold, our corona, right, this is actually sticking out maybe, could be as much as 10 inches, right? Could be as much as 12 inches. But traditionally, the way that was done was this was flashed, okay? And then our roof, of course, was going up above us here. And so, but today what happens is the framers come in here and build a roof pitch over top of this, and then this is roofed. It's just a simple detail. The other way you'll see guys get around this is that they'll build their roof edge like this, where they'll negate the whole thing. I think Stephen Mouzon calls them the pork chop end, that instead of doing this traditional detail, they just kind of, they come over here and they do their trim down like this, and they just kind of cover the whole thing up, right? There are two simple, quick ways that if we just said, wait a minute, guys, I need this returned properly, I need this built properly, you would have roof ends and roof details that are just more beautiful. All right, so my last detail and kind of my last point here is getting porches right and getting porches and columns and beams. If we look at the traditional details of this, the column, the entablature, architrave, frieze, and cornice, right? You have that built up on traditional houses. And so your roof detail will come down, right? And then you have your crown out here, your bed mold, and then your frieze, and then your architrave here, and your column sits on top of it, right? And it will go down onto your porch, and there'll be a pedestal, right? All of these details, this creates your porch beam, right? And so you have a really pretty beam detail, and there's roof above that. what happens is today is that guys have forgotten that the entablature and what the column is supporting is really important, that the column actually has structural strength and is actually lifting up the roof. And the framers will look at it and go, well, I don't need that. And so we'll just take this detail out here, and they come down and they do this, and then the column sits right here, okay? And it'll come right down to the porch. And all of a sudden our column is the proportions of it are tall and thin. Sometimes it's just a tube, there's no emphasis, but the cap will go right up into the beam of the porch ceiling so that it doesn't seem to support anything. But again, traditional building methods and traditional details are there for a reason. And if we could learn to copy them properly, we would have more beautiful buildings and more beautiful details. Okay, so building methods for the 21st century, right? We can look at the past, we can look at how things used to be built and learn so much, right? Not only those classical proportions and classical details, but building methods that work, that water management that used to be, stock and trade of how things used to be built has kind of been lost, kind of been forgotten. And so this lost art of building are the tiny details that can make a huge difference. I said before that the difference between good and great is like 1/8 of an inch. And if you think about the drip edges, you think about a pitch sill, it's not much, but it's those things that help us build better and build more beautifully, because it's a combination, right? A lot of it's just water management so that our buildings can last longer, but a lot of it's beauty too. And when we build things right, people tend to take care of them longer, people tend to love them more, they end up lasting longer. So I think we're going to take time for questions and answers. I really appreciate you guys coming and listening to this talk, learning about the building of the past and how we can build better. Thank you for coming.